Centuries of American sanctions and wars against adversaries, perceived or real. Who is driving the U.S. war machine?
From CGTN headquarters in Beijing, this is The Hub with Wang Guan.
Hello there, and a very warm welcome to The Hub. I'm Wang Guan. There are no winners but losers in wars. We've heard it all the time, but is that really the case? Once upon a time in America, there was this man named Smedley Butler. He was a major general who had served all the commissioned ranks in the U.S. Marine Corps. When he retired, he said this: "I spent 33 years in active military service and most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street, and for the bankers. I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico safe for American oil interests. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys. And in China, I helped see to it that Standard Oil went on its way unmolested. I suspected that I was just part of the racket all the time. Now, I'm sure of it." Wow. As the U.S. has been actively painting China as a global threat, studies show that it's Washington who has been at war for 227 out of its 245-year history. That's more than 92% of the time. Now, many observers say that with America's military, congressional, industrial complex, peace will never be given a chance.
This may sound paradoxical, but the United States, born in the ashes of wars and battles, has been one of the most belligerent countries in the world. After its independence on July the 4th, 1776, in over 240 years, the time for the U.S. not being at war is less than 20 years. Just take the 20th century, for example. Washington engaged in Spanish-American War, the two World Wars, the Korean War, the war against Central American states, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, etc., etc. On September 11, 2001, the U.S. has come under attack for the first time on its home soil after the Cold War, as coordinated terrorist attacks brought down New York's Twin Towers, leaving a trail of destruction, nearly 3,000 dead.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against Al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
Another 20-year U.S. intervention and so-called war on terror in the Middle East kicked off, pulling dozens of countries and millions of civilians into the mire of conflict.
First of all, that the Bush administration was initially culpable because there were many warnings that the attack was coming. And they quite simply, the documentation is very clear. They ignored the warnings. They were in a state of great incompetence and complacency, and thousands of innocent people died as a result.
From the Soviet Union to Syria, from the Middle East to the Asia Pacific, the U.S. has been on a roll with trillions of dollars spent and millions of lives upended. What is fueling U.S. military interventions? Who, indeed, is driving the U.S. war machine?
To talk about who is driving the U.S. war machine, I'm very pleased to be joined today from Chapel Hill by Professor Klaus Laris, Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina, and also from New Jersey by Samira Han, Foreign Policy Analyst. Welcome to both of you to The Hub on CGTN. Samira, let me go to you first. We all know about the discursive power of America. Narratives are important. From the Monroe Doctrine to quote-unquote necessary wars of the First and Second World Wars, from the Red Scare, which justified the Cold War, to the war on terror. A particular national security narrative can certainly rally the crowd behind wars. What are your thoughts on America's war narratives over the decades and centuries?
Well, prior to renewed great power competition, which is the state we're in now with China, before you had a sense of liberal internationalism and idealism in foreign policy that led Americans to believe that promoting democracy abroad would end up benefiting them. Now, I will say that since the war on terror, the primary threat has shifted, like I said, to renewed great power competition with China, but to a lesser extent, Russia. But this shift had already begun under Obama with his pivot to Asia. Now, will they continue their counterterrorism efforts that we saw in the war on terror and throughout? Yes, but now in different parts of the world, especially Africa. It'll be in a different capacity, but within the framework of the U.S. Cold War on China and Russia. And I read a news piece that claimed that Biden would be continuing airstrikes in Afghanistan. And there are actually some whispers I hear that he also might be backing the anti-Taliban resistance, which is how we got here in the first place. So no lessons learned, clearly.
Professor Larry, how do you look at the role, the importance of American narratives promoted by either the military-industrial complex, by its mainstream media, or by the Pentagon, and the role of that to America's wars overseas through the decades?
Well, any country which leads a war, which goes into a war, of course sells this war as positive and as necessary and totally required. But it is true that the military-industrial complex in the United States is problematic. And it is actually the so-called iron triangle. It's Congress as well, not just the military and the defense industry, and sometimes the media too. And that has led to financial dependencies between officials in the Pentagon, particularly when they leave the Pentagon, and the defense industry. Recently, Senator Warren has actually suggested that no official should be allowed to hold shares and stock in defense industry companies, and that also there should be a gap of 4 years between leaving the Pentagon and joining such a company. And I think this is a very wise suggestion, and that would help to, at least to some extent, disentangle the deep connection and very intimate connection between Congress, the defense industry, and the military.
We all know that war is good business. I want to share with you some staggering figures here that our team got. Between 2001 and 2021, the top 5 weapons manufacturers in the United States spent over $2 trillion lobbying the U.S. Congress, and in return, the U.S. federal funding for the top weapons manufacturers grew by nearly 200%. Actually, the growing presence of the military-industrial complex was warned half a century ago by none other than America's own president, General Dwight Eisenhower. Let's listen to what he said 50 years ago.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
Samira, why did Eisenhower's warnings go unheeded?
Well, I mean, this is the war machine, and at the end of the day, the military-industrial complex and the U.S. national security complex and their geopolitical interests are all aligned. And in the case of the war on terror, what we were dealing with at that time was a war against blowback from a CIA regime change policy we had carried out starting in the early 70s. And then it carried over until after the Soviet Union was dissolved. So I look at the military-industrial complex as one of the many tentacles of a U.S. empire that's, at its disposal to carry out its foreign policy agenda. Now, in the future, I do see it continuing to play a role, obviously, but it's going to be one of many tools that'll be used in countering China or containing China, as the U.S. says. You know, it's funny. If you look at past history of the U.S. military-industrial complex, one would think that some action would be taken to weaken it, but instead Biden has endeavored to destroy China's military-industrial complex, and he's even imposed sanctions, so no introspection whatsoever.
Professor Larist, do you agree? I mean, what explains the exponential growth of the military-industrial complex of the United States after, the World War II?
It particularly was a war and terror for the last 20 years. Of course, President Eisenhower had already a point when he made gave his farewell speech in 1961. There was a dangerous growth of the interconnection between the defense industry, politicians, and also Congress. And he warned for militarization of American society. And of course, what he had in view was the battle with the Soviet Union, the Cold War battle with the Soviet Union. Since the end of the Cold War, that problem has actually become even more profound. With the war on terror, more money has gone into the defense industries in order to defeat that worldwide terrorist threat. And 9/11, the attack on the World Trade Center in New York and the Pentagon in Washington, that of course was decisive because it shocked the American nation to its very soul, because it had never happened before that America had been attacked on its own soil. The only exception really was Pearl Harbor at the beginning of the Second World War, but that was not the American mainland. And that 9/11 shocked the American establishment so much and the American people that a lot of more money went into the defense industries to defeat, apparently, international terrorism. And that led to a close interconnection between the industry, the defense elite in the Pentagon, and also Congress. And that has continued. Now, with the end of the Afghanistan war, we should expect a certain scaling down of that interconnection. But so far, that has actually not happened. The Biden administration has just asked for $24 billion more for the next defense budget. And this is a disconcerting development. All countries in the world, including the United States, should not spend more on defense, but should actually divert that money perhaps to climate change, pandemic defeats, and other health issues or social issues, and not to the defense industries. But unfortunately, this is a disconcerting developing among all major industrial powers.
Yeah, the power of the deep state. Samira, let's talk about the role of CIA and the intelligence community. If the U.S. war history has taught us anything, that is CIA is a force to be reckoned with. From Cuba to Guatemala to Nicaragua, from the Middle East to China's Tibet region. How do you look at the role of CIA in sustaining the U.S. war machine?
Well, it has worked since at least World War II. I mean, the long history of regime change to undermine the Soviet Union and counter the influence of socialism started with Iran. And then we saw it a little later in history in Afghanistan, which I keep bringing up. But what happened was Jimmy Carter started the funding program to the Mujahideen to take down the socialist government of Afghanistan. And after that was over, these U.S. warlords were installed into power that led to the Taliban gaining power. And then Osama bin Laden came, he was the Frankenstein to come out of that situation. And this keeps happening over and over again, yet we do not stop. In Libya and most recently in Syria, but because of other foreign intervention, it was not carried out fully. Like I said before, the war on terror was a war against blowback. And I do agree with your guest that it will probably scale down, I guess, the influence of the military-industrial complex, especially when it comes to countering China and Russia. But as far as U.S. foreign policy goes, I've noticed that we've had a sort of recycling of US foreign policy approaches depending on the strategic environment and the threat level, et cetera, et cetera. And now we're going back to that Cold War state. So obviously the foreign policy approach will change and become less militaristic, more devoted to covert warfare, as well as human rights and democracy aid.
Well, the White House says currently it wants to recouple with China instead of decoupling, but we'll have to take whatever Joe Biden's administration said with a pinch of salt, obviously. There are so many perspectives to look at U.S. war machine. For example, Henry Kissinger once explained to me in 2014 about so-called the missionary mentality in U.S. exceptionalism, which explains U.S. interventions overseas. Professor Laris, is there a religious component in U.S. overseas interventions?
No, I don't think it's a religious component, but it certainly is a missionary component. I wouldn't call it religion. And Kissinger is, of course, right, but it's actually quite complex. When you look at the recent 20 years, then American intervention in Afghanistan, above all in Iraq, which was really unjustified and also illegal and caused all sorts of problems of instability in the Middle East, that has to be highly criticized. But when you go back to the Second World War, where the United States defeated Nazi Germany, that was a good thing. And then they intervened to establish democracy in Germany and also in Japan. These were good things. So not all interventions and American military adventures have to be condemned. It is actually largely a problem of the last 20, 30 years since the end of the Cold War and the so-called war on terror. And here I would say America has lost its way in foreign policy, and hopefully the Biden administration can scale that back despite the recent increase in the defense budget.
Yeah, certainly one can argue that the Marshall Plan worked to some extent if you look at today's Germany and many parts of the Western Europe indeed. There are so many ways America conducts its interventions. Economic sanctions is one of them, for example. Let's think about Cuba, the DPRK, Iran. In fact, earlier this year, I had an interview with the Iranian ambassador to China, Ambassador Mohammad Khashoggi-Zadeh, and he told me about the current situation of Iran because of the U.S. economic sanctions.
Unfortunately, because of American sanction, even we couldn't buy a vaccine or even buy the pharmaceutical products or other things. We wanted to buy a vaccine from COVAX, but we had a problem to pay.
Samira, is this even legal? I mean, to impose unilateral sanctions or to get so-called the alliance of the willing to go punish smaller powers simply because they have regimes unfriendly to America or American interests?
Yes, and unilateral coercive measures are illegal under international law. They have to be sanctioned by the United Nations. They've come up with a new version of this, targeted sanctions or smart sanctions, and they say that they're somehow less destructive and less harmful on civilian populations, but recent history shows that that's completely false. Back in the 1990s, the Taliban sanctions prevented them from importing food, and we see this happening again. And recent sanctions on Myanmar and Cambodia have also sort of harmed the civilian population. Now, Biden has been using sanctions like left and right to undermine what he calls authoritarian governments that do not preserve the liberal international order. And he's also said that he's going to keep doing this to counter China and Russia. So everything has to be seen in the broader context of the U.S. Cold War on China.
Professor Laris, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I would say imposing sanctions is certainly a lot better than going to war. That we should notice that often sanctions is a replacement for military action, which is a good thing. Secondly, of course, one should not hit the population. And often sanctions are targeted at governments, at individuals in the government, or rich people in that country, bankers like in Russia. But unfortunately, often the real victims of a sanctions regime is the population. And that also applies to Iran or North Korea. There are justified sanctions on North Korea to prevent North Korea from really developing even more of a nuclear regime. But unfortunately, the sanctions really fall on the general population. They hit the Kim family and the other elite people in North Korea very seldom, but they do hit the food situation in North Korea to some extent. And this is unfortunate. And here, of course, sanctions should be much smarter, should be much more carefully employed, because you do not want to hit the general population. Vaccines and food and things like that should be totally immune from sanctions. They normally are, but they often are affected in terms of unintended consequences. This is very unfortunate and should not happen, of course.
Cuba is another country that is hit by U.S. sanctions. The United States launched the longest economic and trade embargo in history against Cuba. But in 2016, during a news conference in Havana, America's own president, President Barack Obama, himself said the embargo will end because it didn't work.
The reason is logic. If you keep on doing something over and over again for 50 years and it doesn't work, it might make sense to try something new.
Samira, when you look at America's half-century sanctions on Cuba and Washington's accusation today on countries such as China of conducting so-called neo-colonialism, what are your thoughts on all this?
Well, the U.S. government, they openly say that sanctions are used to further U.S. interests and to further U.S. goals. So, I mean, that just tells you it's not about human rights, which is the excuse that they use to sort of get public opinion in their favor. The consequences of sanctions are so harmful that, I mean, it's not worth it at the end. Yes, I do agree with your guest that it's better than military invasion, better than war, but this is just another weapon in America's arsenal to terrorize other populations in the global south.
Professor Lairs, I mean, even if the United States meant well, and even if there were instances where U.S. interventions has, worked, when you think about parts of East Asia and Western Europe, but there are casualties, there are costs. For example, the human cost. At least over 800,000 people have been killed in, for example, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Yemen, and Pakistan. I mean, who should pay for the wars and war casualties?
Of course there are costs, there are many costs, and usually the victims is always the general population. Even soldiers are not the major victims of modern wars, but it's the civilian population, which is actually illegal under international law. But all countries who are involved in some war or other don't seem to pay a lot of respect to that. As far as Cuba was concerned, which we mentioned just before, of course, Cuba is not a threat to America. It's not a threat to American society. And everyone has long since recognized that, including, of course, President Obama, who wanted to change America's policy towards Cuba, going to a gradual acceptance of Cuba as a normal foreign country and abolishing the sanctions. But Cuba has become football in American domestic politics. Cuba as such, and what Cuba does is actually less important than what the parties in America think their voters want them to do. And unfortunately, once Obama was out of office, the Trump administration went back to that old policy towards Cuba, which had been put into place in the 1950s and 1960s. And at the moment, the Cuban policy in America seems to be stuck. No one dares to touch it. But the costs usually are being borne by the civilian population. They're not being borne by the elite of the respective countries.
Mm-hmm. Your point's taken. Samira, any final thoughts? We have about 1 minute left.
Well, I do have final thoughts. I think that in order for us to at least stop getting public opinion in favor of war, we have to unlearn U.S. exceptionalism. And I think that that is the trajectory that should be taken by any sort of anti-interventionists and anti-imperialists in the U.S.
Thank you very much, Samira Han and Professor Lares. Thank you both for joining us on The Hub. Thank you. You've been watching The Hub with me, Wang Guan. We'll be right back after the break.
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
Welcome back to The Hub. Now, let's rewind. Let's go back to history, because history matters. I want to show you part of one of my favorite documentaries, The Untold Stories of the United States, which revealed to us one of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War, at the height of the Cold War between the USSR and the United States, and how a nuclear crisis was averted, barely averted, by the power of a single man.
October 27th, an incident occurred that Schlesinger described as not only the most dangerous moment of the Cold War, it was the most dangerous moment in human history. The Russian ships were heading toward the quarantine line. One of 4 Soviet submarines sent to protect the ships was being hunted all day by the carrier USS Randolph. More than 100 miles outside the blockade, the Randolph began dropping depth charges, unaware the sub was carrying nuclear weapons. The explosion rocked the submarine, which went dark except for emergency lights. The temperature rose sharply, the carbon dioxide in the air reached near lethal levels, and people could barely breathe. Men began to faint and fall down. The suffering went on for 4 hours. Then, the Americans hit us with something stronger. We thought, that's it, the end. Panic ensued. Commander Valentin Savitsky tried without success to reach the general staff. He assumed the war had already started and they were going to die in disgrace for having done nothing. He ordered the nuclear torpedo to be prepared for firing. He turned to the other 2 officers aboard. Fortunately for mankind, the political officer, Vasily Arkhipov, was able to calm him down and convince him not to launch, probably single-handedly preventing nuclear war.
Officer Vasily Arkhipov. We should all remember that name. And hopefully something will be learned from history. And that will do it for this edition of The Hub. If you have any suggestions, comments about today's pick or our show, feel free to get in touch on Facebook, Twitter, and Weibo. Send us your social media content too, because we might just pick them next time around. Thank you for joining us on The Hub. I'm Wang Guan. Our news coverage continues at CGTN. Bye for now.